You may feel like the pain you've endured has gone unnoticed, like the people who hurt you got away with it. But here's the truth. God keeps the receipts. Nothing goes unseen. Nothing goes unaccounted for. And that should both comfort you and challenge you. Think about this. Studies show that nearly 1 in 3 people in the U.S. feel deeply betrayed at some point in their lives by a friend, a spouse, a family member, or even a church leader. That's millions of people walking around with invisible wounds, feeling like justice will never come. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe you've spent sleepless nights replaying conversations, wondering how someone who hurt you so deeply could be out there living life as if nothing happened. But what if I told you that the silence of justice doesn't mean the absence of it? There's a story in the Bible that hits home. You've probably heard of Joseph, the young man with dreams of greatness, favored by his father, but betrayed by his own brothers. They weren't just jealous. They hated him enough to throw him into a pit, sell him into slavery, and lie to their father saying he was dead. Now imagine that was you. Imagine being thrown away by the very people who should have protected you, the ones who should have had your back. Joseph had every reason to believe that God had forgotten him. Years passed. No justice, no apology, no sign that the people who hurt him would ever pay for what they did. Some of you are living in that same waiting period. You've been hurt, you've been wronged, and you're wondering, does God even see what they did to me? But here's where the story shifts. God saw it all. And he wasn't just watching, he was working. Every betrayal Joseph endured positioned him for something greater. What seemed like injustice was actually God setting him up for a comeback, so powerful that even his enemies would have to bow before him. Now, let's make this personal. Who betrayed you? Who walked away when you needed them the most? Who stabbed you in the back and never even looked back? You may never get an apology. You may never hear them admit they were wrong. But you don't need to, because God saw everything. And if you still doubt that God is watching, just look at real life. Think about those stories where people rise from the ashes, where the ones who were overlooked, lied on, and mistreated somehow end up in positions of power and influence. That's not luck. That's God's justice system at work. There was a woman who lost everything after being falsely accused at work. She was humiliated, fired, and left struggling to make ends meet. Years later, the same company that let her go under false pretenses came back to her, not to apologize, but to offer her a leadership role because their business was failing without her. The same people who tried to break her had to come back and acknowledge her worth. She didn't have to fight for it. God saw it all, and he handled it. So let me ask you, what are you still carrying? What pain are you holding on to because you think justice is in your hands? What would happen if you truly trusted that God is watching and he will handle it in his time, his way? The problem is we often want immediate payback. We want people to hurt like they hurt us. But God's way is different. Sometimes he allows time to pass so he can not only deal with those who hurt you, but also prepare you to handle the blessing that comes after. Imagine if Joseph had confronted his brothers too soon. Imagine if he had taken matters into his own hands. He would have forfeited the throne that God had prepared for him. Some of us are so focused on revenge that we're missing our promotion. The truth is, you don't have to fight for yourself. You don't have to chase down those who wronged you. You don't have to waste your energy plotting revenge. Because the God who sees all is the God who settles all. And when he does it, it's always in a way that leaves no doubt that he was in control the whole time. So here's my challenge to you. Will you trust that God sees everything? Will you believe that nothing done against you goes unnoticed? Will you let go and let God work not just on them, but on you? Because while God is dealing with those who hurt you, He's also preparing something greater for you. And if you hold on to that, you'll realize that what felt like injustice was actually the setup for something bigger than you ever imagined. Hold on, keep the faith. God is watching and He's working. You've probably heard people say, life isn't fair. And if you've ever been hurt, betrayed, or wronged, you know exactly what that feels like. But let me ask you something. If life isn't fair, then where is justice? Where is God in all of it? Shockingly, statistics show that about 70% of people feel like they've been treated unfairly at some point in their lives, whether by family, friends, employers, or even strangers. That means right now, millions of people are walking around carrying the weight of injustice, feeling like no one will ever make things right. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe you've been waiting for the people who hurt you to get what they deserve. But it seems like they're thriving while you're still picking up the pieces. But what if I told you that God's justice doesn't always look the way we expect? There's a story in the Bible that proves this, and it's one that doesn't sit well with most people. It's about David and King Saul. David was loyal, faithful, and obedient to God. He didn't ask to be chosen as king. God anointed him. But Saul, driven by jealousy and insecurity, spent years trying to destroy him. David had to run for his life, hide in caves, and live like a fugitive, all because someone else couldn't handle his calling. Now, pause for a moment. Can you relate to that? Have you ever been attacked, not because you did something wrong, but simply because someone else couldn't handle who you were becoming? Maybe it was a boss who tried to sabotage you, a friend who turned on you, or a family member who couldn't stand to see you rise. David had every reason to seek revenge. He even had the opportunity twice to kill Saul and end his suffering, but he didn't. Why? Because David understood something most of us struggle with. God's justice is different from human justice. If David had taken matters into his own hands, he might have won the battle but lost the war. Instead, he chose to trust God's timing. And in the end, Saul destroyed himself. But let's bring this closer to real life. There was a man who worked at a company for years, pouring his heart and soul into his job. One day, his boss falsely accused him of something he didn't do and had him fired. He lost everything: his income, his stability, his peace of mind. But instead of fighting back, he walked away and trusted that God would make things right. Fast forward a few years. That same boss who fired him, he was exposed for corruption and lost his job in disgrace. Meanwhile, the man who was wrongfully fired, he started his own business, became more successful than he ever imagined, and never had to look back. God's justice took longer than he wanted, but when it came, it was undeniable. And that's the hardest part, isn't it, Wailing? When we see people getting away with their actions, when we watch them prosper while we suffer, it's easy to question God. But let me ask you, do you trust Him even when you don't see justice right away? Do you believe that God is still working even when it looks like nothing is happening? One of the biggest mistakes we make is assuming that because justice isn't immediate, it isn't coming. But God is strategic. Sometimes He allows things to play out so that when He moves, there's no doubt that it was Him. That's why the Bible says in Romans 12:19, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." If you try to take justice into your own hands, you might win the fight, but you'll lose the favor. You'll step outside of God's plan and settle for something far less than what He had in store. But when you let Him fight for you, the victory is greater than anything you could have imagined. So what's your story? Who hurt you? Who got away with something that left you broken? Are you still holding on to the need for revenge? Or are you willing to trust that the God who sees all will handle it in His perfect time? The truth is, there will always be people who do wrong and seem to prosper, but don't be fooled. That's temporary. God's justice is eternal. And when He moves, it's not just about dealing with your enemies. It's about setting you up for something greater. So don't waste your energy chasing revenge. Instead, focus on becoming everything God has called you to be. Because while you're waiting for justice, He's preparing your next victory. Revenge feels natural. When someone hurts us, betrays us, or disrespects us, our first instinct is to make them feel the same pain they caused us. But let's be real. Has revenge ever truly made anyone whole? Studies show that people who seek revenge often feel worse afterward, not better. Instead of healing, they carry more anger, more bitterness, and more regret. But what if I told you that God never designed you to carry that weight? There's a reason Romans 12:19 says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." God isn't saying this just to be in control. He's saying it because He knows that revenge is a trap. It doesn't set you free, it keeps you bound. It doesn't fix the problem, it creates more damage. Let's talk about a real-life story. A woman was betrayed by her best friend. This wasn't just a small disagreement. This friend spread lies, ruined her reputation, and turned people against her. The woman was devastated. She wanted to fight back. She wanted to expose every lie and make sure the truth came out. But something inside her whispered, "Let it go. Let me handle it." That was hard. It felt like she was losing. It felt like she was letting the other person win. But she obeyed. She didn't defend herself. She didn't seek revenge. She just kept walking. Fast forward a year. That same friend who tried to destroy her, she ended up being exposed in a completely unrelated situation. Everything she did to others came back on her, without the woman ever having to lift a finger. And in the meantime, the woman's life flourished. She built new friendships, restored her peace, and walked into opportunities she never imagined. Now let me ask you, what would have happened if she had taken matters into her own hands? Would she have felt better? Or would she have been dragged into a battle that God never intended her to fight? That's the thing about revenge. It feels right in the moment, but it costs you later. Think about it. How much peace have you lost replaying the hurt in your mind? How much energy have you wasted thinking about how to get even? And what if all that time was actually meant to be spent moving forward, healing, and walking into something greater? Joseph could have sought revenge. After everything his brothers did, betraying him, selling him, leaving him for dead, he could have used his power to make them pay. But he didn't. Instead, he said something powerful. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Genesis 50:20. What if you started seeing your pain that way? What if instead of asking, "How can I get even?" you asked, "God, how are you using this for my good?" Let's be real. It's not easy. It's hard to trust God when you want answers now. It's hard to let go when you feel like people are getting away with things. But here's the truth. No one gets away with anything. God sees it all. And when He handles it, He does it in a way that's bigger and better than anything you could do yourself. So, what's your story? Who hurt you? Who do you still want revenge against? And what would happen if you truly let it go and trusted that God's justice is better than yours? Because when you release the need for revenge, you don't lose, you win. You walk lighter, you move faster, And most importantly, you make room for God to fight for you in ways you never imagined. And when God fights for you, the victory is always greater. Pain is something we all try to avoid. No one wakes up and says, I hope I go through something painful today. But what if pain isn't just something to survive? What if it's actually preparation? Studies show that some of the most successful people in the world have endured the deepest struggles, from childhood trauma to financial ruin to betrayal by people they trusted. Yet, instead of being destroyed by their pain, they were shaped by it. Could it be that what you're going through right now isn't punishment, but positioning? Think about Joseph. He had dreams of greatness, but before the throne came the pit, the slavery, and the prison. Imagine how confusing that must have been. God, you gave me this vision, so why am I suffering? Maybe you've asked that question too. Maybe you thought following God would make life easier, but instead you found yourself in a season of pain that doesn't make sense. A woman once lost everything, her job, her home, and even some of the people closest to her. She couldn't understand why God would allow it. She had been faithful, she had prayed, she had trusted Him, but life still fell apart. It wasn't until years later that she realized something. Everything she lost was actually making space for something greater. The job she cried over, it would have kept her stuck. The relationships that ended, they would have drained her purpose. What she thought was a breakdown was actually a breakthrough in disguise. How many times have you thought your pain was God's way of punishing you, when in reality it was His way of preparing you? Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before leading God's people. David spent years running from Saul before taking the throne. Even Jesus had to go through betrayal, suffering, and the cross before stepping into resurrection power. If all of them had to endure pain before their purpose, why do we think we should be any different? What if the rejection wasn't rejection, but redirection? What if the delay wasn't denial, but divine timing? What if what feels like suffering is actually strength training for the blessing ahead? We don't like pain because we think it's a sign that something is wrong. But sometimes pain is proof that something is being built. Muscles grow through resistance. Diamonds are formed under pressure. Gold is refined in fire. And in the same way, the fire you're going through right now isn't meant to destroy you, it's meant to prepare you. So what have you been going through that feels unfair? What pain have you been asking God to take away? And what if instead of asking, why me, you started asking, what are you preparing me for? Because the truth is, God doesn't waste pain. And when you finally see the purpose behind it, you'll realize that what you thought was breaking you was actually making you stronger than ever before. It's hard to understand why people hurt us. Sometimes it feels like they're intentionally trying to derail our lives. It's painful, frustrating, and confusing. But what if I told you that in some cases, the very people who hurt you might actually be part of God's plan to get you where He wants you to go? It's a tough pill to swallow, but let me challenge you with this. God can use even your enemies to push you into your purpose. Let's take the story of Joseph. After being betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, Joseph could have been bitter. He could have been angry at God for letting him go through all of that. But instead, he chose to trust God's plan. He didn't realize it at the time, but the betrayal of his brothers, the people who should have loved and protected him, was the very thing that pushed him into the position where he could eventually save not just his family, but an entire nation. It was his brothers' actions that led him to Pharaoh's court. Their hatred and jealousy pushed him into a situation where he could rise to power, and in the end, he was able to offer grace and forgiveness when they came to him in their time of need. Without their betrayal, Joseph wouldn't have been in the right place at the right time to fulfill his God-given purpose. Think about your life. Who hurt you? Who abandoned you? Who betrayed you? Maybe you've spent years trying to move past the pain, trying to figure out why it happened. But what if God allowed it for a reason? What if the very people who caused you the most pain were unknowingly pushing you into your purpose? Let me share a real-life example that's both powerful and relatable. A young woman named Sarah had always dreamed of being in the fashion industry. She worked tirelessly, went to school and put in the hours, but her big break never seemed to come. Instead, she found herself stuck in a low-paying job at a department store, barely scraping by. She was discouraged, frustrated, and doubted if she was ever going to make it. One day, her boss, someone she had worked with for years, betrayed her trust in a major way. She was unfairly demoted, her position was taken away, and someone who barely knew the company was promoted to her role. It felt like a personal attack. Sarah wanted to quit, lash out, and make sure her boss paid for what she had done, but instead she took a step back, asked God to help her forgive, and chose to walk in peace. A few months later, Sarah got an opportunity she never saw coming. A major fashion brand was opening a new store and needed someone with the skills she had gained in the department store industry. She ended up landing a job that launched her into a career she had always dreamed of. The demotion she thought was the worst thing to ever happen to her was actually the catalyst for her promotion. Now, I know it's hard to imagine how the people who hurt you could have any positive impact on your life, but think about Joseph again. When he finally saw his brothers years later in their time of desperation, he could have sought revenge. He could have demanded justice and made them suffer for what they did. But instead, he said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." What if we started looking at our pain from a different perspective? Instead of asking, "Why did they hurt me?" what if we asked, "How is God using this for my good?" How could your pain be pushing you into something bigger than you could ever imagine? Consider the people in your life who've caused you hurt. Maybe you've been deeply wounded by family, friends, or colleagues. Have you ever thought that just maybe the difficulties they caused are part of your divine setup? That by pushing you into a place of discomfort, they forced you to lean on God in a way that has prepared you for what's ahead? I get it. This is not easy. It's hard to think that anyone who's hurt you could have had any positive role in your life, but the truth is, God can use anything for good, even betrayal, rejection, and pain. He works all things together for the good of those who love Him. Even the people who want to harm you can be used to get you where you need to be. So as hard as it may be, try to shift your perspective. Instead of holding on to bitterness or anger, consider this. What if the people who hurt you are knowingly playing a part in God's bigger plan for you? What if their actions are pushing you toward the purpose you've been praying for? The next time someone betrays you, rejects you, or tries to bring you down, ask yourself, how is God using this to position me for something greater? Because when you start to see your pain as purpose, when you understand that the very people who hurt you might be part of your divine plan, everything changes. You stop being a victim of your circumstances and become a victor in God's story for your life. God can use even the most painful experiences to propel you into your destiny. Trust that He's working even when it doesn't look like it. Because sometimes the people who hurt you are just part of the journey that leads you to the place you were always meant to be. Forgiveness is one of the hardest things to do when you've been hurt. You may think, how could I possibly forgive someone who hurt me so deeply? It feels impossible, doesn't it? But here's the truth. Forgiveness is not for them, it's for you. Let me tell you something that might shock you. Studies have shown that unforgiveness can literally affect your health. People who hold on to grudges have higher levels of stress, increased risk of heart disease, and a weakened immune system. In other words, holding on to bitterness doesn't just hurt your heart emotionally, it affects your body physically. But when you forgive, you let go of that burden and allow your body and mind to heal. I know this is difficult to grasp, especially when the pain is so deep. Let me share a real-life example with you. There's a man named John who had been wronged by his best friend. This wasn't just a small betrayal. His friend had stolen from him, lied to him, and caused him a great deal of financial and emotional stress. For years, John couldn't move forward. He felt like he had been robbed, and every time he thought about his friend, the anger would rise up inside him. He couldn't understand how someone he trusted so much could betray him in such a way. For a long time, John thought about revenge. He wanted to make his friend feel the same pain, and he considered doing everything he could to ruin his life in the same way he'd been hurt. But as time went on, John realized something. His anger wasn't hurting his friend, it was hurting him. Every day he carried that bitterness with him. It kept him stuck in the past, unable to move forward. One day, John decided to take a step that changed his life. He chose to forgive. And let me tell you, this wasn't easy. Forgiveness didn't mean excusing what his friend had done or pretending it didn't hurt. It simply meant choosing to let go of the desire for revenge. It meant releasing the hold that anger and bitterness had on his heart. The change didn't happen overnight, but over time, something incredible started to shift. John's health improved. He felt lighter. His mind was clearer. He was able to move on with his life and even found new opportunities that he had been blind to before. What's more, John eventually found out that his former friend was going through a tough time and was genuinely sorry for the harm he had caused. Forgiveness doesn't always lead to reconciliation, but it always leads to freedom. When you forgive, you free yourself from the chains of resentment and bitterness that keep you from moving forward. You make space for healing, peace, and new beginnings. Think about it. How much energy do you spend thinking about the person who hurt you? How much time do you waste replaying the hurt over and over again in your mind? What if all that energy could be used for something better? Something that brings you peace and growth. I understand it's not easy to forgive, but ask yourself this: is holding on to that anger worth it? Is it worth the physical toll it takes on your body? Is it worth the emotional drain that keeps you from enjoying the life God has for you? There's a beautiful story in the Bible about Jesus on the cross. As he hung there in agony, surrounded by people who mocked him, betrayed him, and had just nailed him to the cross, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Jesus, in his greatest moment of suffering, chose to forgive. And if he could forgive those who were actively hurting him, what's stopping you from forgiving those who have hurt you? Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It doesn't mean you have to stay in a toxic relationship or put yourself in a position to be hurt again. It simply means you're no longer letting that person control your future. You're no longer letting the hurt they caused define you. Take a moment to think about who you might need to forgive. Is there someone in your life who has hurt you and you've been holding on to that pain for far too long? What would happen if you chose to forgive them? Not for their sake, but for yours. Remember, forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it frees you to embrace the future. It allows you to move forward with peace, joy, and the ability to heal. And when you forgive, you make room for God to work in your life in ways you never imagined. So, If you're holding on to a grudge today, I encourage you to let go. Release the pain. Choose forgiveness. It may not be easy, but it will set you free